What were the major causes, influences, and ultimately what was the major impact of the American Revolution? What was the economic impact? What was the political impact? How did the American Revolution change history? We're going to be talking about a little bit of that for this video. Let me start off by saying that this video is dedicated to Beck. Beck, you're awesome. If anybody else would like a specialized video, well, too bad. I'm just kidding. Just miss one of my classes, and then I'll make a video explaining what I explained in class. So easy as that. Now, just feel free to reach out if there's a particular topic. Anyway, so in this class we've been kind of talking about the nature of power, what makes nations powerful, how power dynamics shift and change through things such as revolutions, political movements. We'll be talking about that a little bit in the future of this class. Kind of one of the first case studies that we're dealing with is the American Revolution and how the power dynamic, what were some of the big major ideas that were introduced by the American Revolution and how this changed, as we'll see, kind of our conception of government and what governments are supposed to do. Now, when examining any time period or event in history, it's helpful to kind of have guiding questions that can show us how to investigate these events, what we're kind of looking for when we look at these events. And so I've kind of narrowed it down to these four questions. What were the causes of a particular event? Why did this happen? And why did this happen when it happened is another way to kind of look at that. What were the results? What happened after the event? What sort of change did the event produce? Who was impacted by this event? Is it a large scale political event in which governmental structures are changing? Or is it more so a bottom up sort of thing where the lives of individuals are changing? Is it more of an environmental impact where the environment's changing? There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can interpret and take this. And then what are the implications? What are the long term implications of this event? Now, in terms of causes, there are a bunch of different causes that you can identify that led up to the American Revolution. This is a very big, broad picture overview. So feel free to go into more depth on your own if you're interested in this. But one of the big reasons leading to the American Revolution is the advent of 15th century colonialism. Now, colonialism is another one of those topics that we could probably spend an entire class talking about because it's so complicated and it literally happened across the globe by a bunch of different nations. So there's a lot of digging we could go into with each one of those particular nations and their particular style of colonialism. Instead, what we're going to do is focus on colonialism in the Americas, in North, Central, and South America specifically. So, beginning in the 15th century, countries in Europe started to expand their political and economic power into other parts of the globe. Aside from Europe, there's again, if we want to look at the reasons for that, there's a lot of reasons for that. We'll just keep it simple. They were trying to access the trade markets of Asia, specifically India and China, and they were looking for new routes to do so. So when we're talking about the Americas, we're going to focus on four main European colonial powers: the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, and the English. Those are going to be the major players. There's also the Dutch, and eventually there's going to be like so the Russians and stuff like that. But those are the big four: the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, and the English. And so let's talk a little bit about where they colonized in the Americas. And one of the things that I did in class was to ask, if you want to know the answer to this question, was to think about within a modern context, what languages do these nations speak today? What is the predominant language in these areas? And that will give you a hint as to who their main colonizer were. Now, in a lot of these places, they're going to switch hands from the Spanish to the French and from the French to the Americans. But look at the main languages. So, for example, look at this map, and you can go ahead and answer this to yourself to see if you get the question right. Who do you think, for example, let's start with the Spanish. Who do you think the Spanish colonized? Well, look, what nations in modern North, Central, and South America where what nations is the predominant language Spanish. So let me zoom in on my map a little bit so I can make use of this awesome whiteboard. All right, so the Spanish are the first to reach the Americas. Now, initially, they're going to land in the Caribbean here. This is a terrible arrow, but oh boy, it keeps getting worse. They're going to land in the Caribbean and they're going to colonize islands. So we have, and this is a horrible map, so I apologize in advance, but they're going to colonize islands like Cuba. And then from Cuba, they're going to make their way into the mainland. One of the first areas that they're going to land and are going to be interested in is in modern day Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula. So, another question, well, why are they interested in this area? And you have to remember the purpose of colonization, first and foremost, is to make money. The reasons for the exploration and the colonization was to access the Asian markets. They found this massive new continents and land masses, and so they want to figure out how to make money. One of the immediate ways that they're going to be making money, especially for the Spanish. The Portuguese, the French, and the English, not so much. But for the Spanish, the immediate way they're going to be making money is, of course, gold that they're going to be stealing and robbing from the Native American civilizations that are there. Specifically, in the Yucatan Peninsula is the base of the Aztec civilization, which they will encounter. And the Spanish will expand from there to incorporate all of modern day Mexico and parts of the southeastern United States. And this map is the lines that I'm drawing are not to scale, so take this with a grain of salt. But the Spanish are going to make their way up into modern day states like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. And the Spanish are also going to find their way down into South America. Again, ask yourself, which of these countries speak Spanish? Almost all of them, with one major exception that we'll get to. Now, if the Spanish are going into Mexico to conquer the Aztecs to make money, why are they going down into South America? The key in South America is going to be the Inca Empire, which was phenomenally wealthy. So the Spanish are in modern day Mexico, South America. Are they going to be in North America? Yes, they are, specifically in the state of Florida. So after the Spanish, we have the Portuguese. I'm going to use yellow for the Portuguese. I said there was one major exception in Latin America as to who speaks Spanish. That exception, of course, is Brazil. The national language there is Portuguese. Portugal is going to take over. Spain and Portugal kind of split South America. It's a long story there, but they agree to split South America with Portugal taking what is modern day Brazil. So we got the Spanish, we got the Portuguese. Up next, we have the French. So again, ask yourself, where in North America is French frequently spoken, or where French is the predominant language? And in the Caribbean. The French are also going to land. Again, this map is pretty horrible. You can't really see it here, but one of the places that the French are going to colonize is modern day Haiti. The French predominantly going to focus on, and there's a reason why they're in the Caribbean. This has to do with the nature of cash crops, different story for different day. The French are also going to focus on North America. So what cities in North America speak French? Well, of course, you have cities like Quebec. The French are also going to extend their influence into the Great Lakes region to get involved with the fur trade. Geographically speaking, the Great Lakes actually connect to the Gulf of Mexico via the Mississippi River Basin, and another major area, another major city of the French is going to be the city of New Orleans, which, as I told to my classes, if you haven't been to New Orleans, it's one of my absolute favorite cities. You should absolutely go. So we have the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, and last but not least, which will lead us to the American Revolution, the causes of it, is the English. And the English are going to colonize specifically the eastern coast of the United States. We have the original 13 colonies that are going to be there. Oops, I took myself off. That's what I'm looking for. So colonialism is the background to the American Revolutions because those initial 13 colonies are going to start off as colonies. Now, English colonialism is going to be very different from Spanish or French colonialism, mostly because the English are going to actually establish in their colonies, they're going to have like colonial legislators who are going to implement and develop their own laws, rules, and regulations for their colonies in a way that the French and the Spanish just aren't interested in doing. And the British are also going to have a direct pipeline from Britain to the colonies where people are moving from one place. There's going to be migrations of people from one place to the other in a way that the Spanish and the French did it. But there's still going to be colonies. And as I indicated before, the purpose of colonialism as an economic system, there's this idea that develops towards the end of the 17th century, I believe, shortly after the Glorious Revolution, idea called mercantilism. And this is an economic idea that the reason for the colonies, colonialism is a one-way street. The European nations had colonies in order to extract as much wealth, resources, and raw material from those colonies as possible. The purpose of colonialism is not to build up the area that you're colonizing, but to take as much from it as possible. Now, this was weird and interesting in the English colonies of North America, because these, in a lot of cases, were British citizens who saw themselves as part of the British Empire. This was one of the big tension points that kind of led up to the American Revolution, is they were befuddled, to use a word. They were very confused as to why they were being treated the way they were being treated, because after all, they considered themselves to be citizens of the British Empire. But the British colonies in North America, there's going to be heavy legislation that's going to be passed that targets them for a particular set of taxes, starting with things like the navigation taxes. Eventually, we get to sugar tax, tea tax, the Stamp Act, the Township Tariff Act. All of these taxes and legislation that is passed is geared to target the colonies in order to extract heavier and heavier tax burden from them to get more and more money from them. And that's why you can really think of the American revolutions in terms of an economic revolution. Typically speaking, in history class, a lot of people perceive the American Revolution as being about like the overthrowing of a king, but from an economic standpoint, it really boils down to the fact that they didn't want to be taxed. The French Revolution will have heavy like anti-monarchy undertones to it. Now, as we'll see, there's certainly a major philosophical element to this that I want to focus on. But the reasons and the causes of the revolution really has to do with the feeling that the colonists had that they were being unjustly treated by the British Empire, despite the fact that they were British citizens. And this has to do with the series of taxes that were levied against them. But let me continue on, because I don't want to get too bogged down in here. So this is a quote that I shared in class. This is John Adams writing to Thomas Jefferson. And this is what Adams, I think this is like super interesting. And this is what Adams had to say about the reflecting back on the American Revolution. Adams says, "As to the history of the revolution, my ideas may be peculiar, perhaps singular, but what do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775. I like this quote because it indicates to us that when you think of the American Revolution, what do you think of? Most people typically think of the battles that were fought. Maybe they think of like the Boston Massacre or the Boston Tea Party. Maybe you think of like when it first started with the battles of Lexington and Concord, or maybe you think of like, I'm from the South, so we have here in the city of Savannah, parts of the American Revolution were actually fought in the South. That's really cool. There's like an archaeological site of an old fort that we had here, the Southern ports were specifically targeted by the British Navy. So that maybe that's what I think of when I first think of it. But Adams suggests that the real revolution, so looking here now in terms of what was the impact of the American Revolution, and who did it impact, and what were the results? So obviously the American Revolution resulted in the creation of a new nation, the United States. But one of the unforeseen impacts was the impact, as Adams indicate, was the revolution in human consciousness, to use abstract psychological language, was the revolution that took place in people's mind. And that revolution changed the way that people think of and perceive of government, of where we believe, going back to the theme of this class related to power, where we think power resides and where does power come from and what gives somebody the right to have power over us. Now, these are not ideas that are unique to the American Revolution per se. This sort of revolution of the mind was something that had already been happening in modern philosophy. And you don't really need to know this because this extends well beyond the scope of this class. But there are some, and this is a little bit ironic, I guess, there are some British political philosophers, two people specifically, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. You also have French thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who start to develop alternative theories of government. And this is one of the big questions that they had. Where do governments derive their political power from? And what gives government the right to rule over people? Prior to the 15th and 16th century, if you were to go back in time and ask somebody like, what gives the king the right to rule, what they would have told you corresponds to a political philosophy called divine right. And I have here a picture. This is from the cover or one of the inside pages of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. This is the king, and as you can see, the king's garments, robes is composed of a bunch of different people. So where does the king derive his power? As we'll see, Hobbes will have a different answer, but the sort of classical answer to that is this idea called divine right. So let's talk about one of the things that makes, and again, me with the horrible drawing, let me make that a little thicker. Maybe that'll be easier. There we go. One of the things that makes the American Revolution so revolutionary, that's supposed to be a K. That's so bad. What am I doing? Okay, let me try this again. Oh my gosh, I can't draw on the computer. All right, I'll just make this a person. And he's got a crown. So this is the king. Okay, so what gives the king power? Well, if you were to go prior to the American Revolution, prior to the early modern period, they would say that what gives the king power is, this is going to be God. God in a box. The G in the box. This is God. What gives the king power is God. So why does a king have the right to rule? Because God gave that king the right to rule. And then under the king, we have you, me, and everybody else. I'll do a horrible job drawing stick figures. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. We're all sad because the king has the right to rule over us. The king can tell us to do whatever the king wants to tell us to do. The king has absolute power given to him by God. Divine right says that that's where government derives its power. The government is justified. The king is justified in his rule by the divine. One of the things that makes the American Revolution so revolutionary is it promotes an alternative philosophical theory of power. This is a philosophical theory of power that was promoted by people like Rousseau, Hobbes, and Locke. This was deeply influential for the American Revolution. And that alternative theory of power, going back to what happened to my picture, there we go. That alternative theory of power flips that power structure on its head. So at that former power structure, we had God's at the very top, followed by the king, and then everybody else is at the bottom. Flips that power structure on its head. So in Hobbes's Leviathan, Hobbes says, the king derives his power not from the divine or from any sort of supernatural source. Rather, the king derives his power from the consent of the governed is the language that Locke will use. The king is king because the people agree that he's king. So we have a switching of those power structures. And in one of those systems, it's very top heavy with the king slash God at the top and then the people at the bottom. And we flip that around because government in this power in the inverse triangle, I see shapes in my head. So in the inverse triangle, it's the people that are the basis of the foundation of power. And you can see this reflected in early American documents from the American Revolution, such as the Declaration of Independence. And this is what we also read in class. So let's read the first couple of sentences of the Declaration of Independence together. And this is another thing I could teach an entire class on. I think this is an absolutely fascinating document. But this gets to kind of what I'm talking about. So the first sentence there, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another. So that idea I was just telling you about, that it is the consent of the governed, it is the agreement of the people which gives government the source of its power. That's an idea called social contract theory. Government exists and government has power because we all, as citizens, agree that it exists and agree that it has power. And another revolutionary idea that emerges from this is if we as a people can give government power, then we as a people can choose to withdraw that power. This is where the idea of the social contract comes into play. Me as an individual, I agree to enter society under the assumption that society is going to give something back to me. I will give up certain freedoms that I have. I'll give up my absolute freedom to do whatever I want. I'll play by the rules of society. And in return, I'm getting other things that society's stability, right? Society gives me stability. So society gives me access to a life I otherwise wouldn't be able to live. All these sorts of things. That's where the social contract comes into play. But one of the revolutionary ideas is that under the social contract theory, revolution is philosophically justifiable. Previously, under divine right, to rebel against the king is also to rebel against who? Is to rebel against God. So rebellion wasn't necessarily something that was ever truly justifiable in that sense, but with social contract, and this is what you see here in the Declaration of Independence, it's a dissolving of that contract. You broke your side of the contract, so we are removing ourselves from that agreement. We were dissolving those political bands and assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the law of nature, there's this idea in the Enlightenment that there are certain natural laws, different story for a different day, as well as nature's God, entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes of their independence, declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And the most famous line of the revolution, let me pull this up separately. Okay, sorry, I didn't add that into a slide. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit there. Is that kind of readable? Maybe not, but I'll send it to you. Okay. So most famous line, and as I told the class, probably without a doubt, top 5, at least minimum top 5 most famous influential sentences in the English language, if not the most famous influential sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away from them by any governmental agency or organization, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, one of the things that we talked about in class, this line's famous for a few reasons. So what is the right to life? What is the right to life? Well, the right to life, according to people like Hobbes and Locke, if you want to think about it more philosophically, who owns your right to live? That's a weird question. Who owns your right to live? So according to Hobbes, if you look at like what counts as like possession, what counts as ownership in a state of nature, in a state in which government doesn't exist, in what sense do I own my phone, for example? Well, in a state of nature in which government don't exist, if I'm walking through nature and let's say I come across a phone tree, this is a weird example. We'll switch to fruit example. Who owns an apple? I don't have an apple, but you can imagine. So I'm walking through the woods. I see an apple tree. I pick the apple. Where does ownership come in? For Locke, the ownership comes in with my physically reaching out and plucking the apple. In a state of nature, nobody owns that apple. It's just a natural part of the world. Nobody can claim ownership to that. What brings ownership is this idea of work, that I have done something in particular to obtain that apple that you did not do. That's why I own it and you do not. Well, who owns your life? In a state of nature, there's only one person who owns your life, and that of course is you, and nobody can take that away. This is interesting that this is written in the context of the American Revolution, in which we have things like the institution of slavery. Again, different story for a different day. Liberty, building off of that, not only do you have the right to your own life, you have the right to freedom, speaking of slavery, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, happiness is a weird word, and it's a weird word choice that Jefferson chose to include in that. So what the heck, and you can have a really great discussion about this, what the heck does Jefferson mean by happiness? Because when most people think of happiness, they think, well, having Starbucks every day makes me happy. But do you have the right to that? Does that mean that Starbucks ought to be provided to you, maybe free of charge, or that you ought to have access to it, or any sort of like material possession or comfort that people think of when they think of being happy, laying on their couch watching Netflix or something like that? That's not really what Jefferson means by happiness here. He has more so in mind what the Greek philosopher Aristotle had in mind when Aristotle talked about happiness. And this is this idea of eudaimonia, which roughly translates to well-being. So Jefferson said, amongst the right to life and liberty, that citizens ought to have the right to happiness. And you can think about this in terms of potential, in terms of human flourishing. And this raises the question, because we are talking about a contract, what is the government's role in ensuring its citizens are flourishing? And that's about as far as we got in our class discussion. So that's where I'll end this video. I hope all of that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, let me know. I'll see all of you next time.